Hello and welcome to The Way. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, it's 10 years since the incredible encyclical that Pope Francis wrote, Laudato Si, which was really urging us to care for our common home, to look after the planet, and also just addressing the urgency that's needed in terms of climate change and the impact that's having, particularly on the most vulnerable in the world. So, recently, to mark this 10-year anniversary, an incredible conference was organised. Ireland had a lot to do with it. It was in Castel Gandolfo in Italy, and Pope Leo actually addressed the conference. So join with me in studio to tell us all about it and what might happen next. What might the impacts be? I have Dr. Lorna Gold with me in studio now. Lorna is the coordinator for the Laudato Si movement, and Jane Mellet of Troker, who does a lot of work in this area and with church outreach as well. And both of them were heavily involved in the conference and could tell us all about it. Really, Lorna, this was your idea, this whole conference. Tell us about it, where it all started and what it looked like in the end from the original dream.
Yeah, in some ways, yes, it was my idea. The idea for this conference started really at the start of this year, when the Jubilee was announced and the theme for the Jubilee, which was Pilgrims of Hope. And we wanted to do something to mark the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si. Now, things took their own turn this year. As we know, Pope Francis passed away in April, and then Pope Leo was elected. And as a movement which was so connected to Pope Francis, we had such a personal relationship with him over the last 10 years, we wondered what was going to happen next. So I wrote to him, as everybody did, like as church people involved in church movements, wrote to him to say I'd just taken over at Laudato Si movement, and reminded him it was the 10th anniversary and said we were hosting this conference in Castel Gandolfo in October. And in return, he invited me to Rome to meet him on the actual anniversary of Laudato Si, which is at the end of May. And then had the opportunity to say, would you come? Um, and within a few days, literally the 5th of June, I got a letter from the Holy Father to say he wanted to come in person to the conference in Castel Gandolfo. And to say that we've been on a wild adventure since then
Very
is
quickly it
an
turned into a different
understatement.
animal, yeah.
Well, to give you a sense of the scale, we were thinking 200 people in total for the conference. On the 1st of October in Castel Gandolfo, we had 200 media outlets. We had 1,200 people in person at the event from 80 different countries, many people from within the church, but many people from secular organisations, big names in the climate movement like Mary Robinson, Kumi Naidoo, Bill McKibben, Lawrence Tubiana, and of course, who made the headlines was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who agreed to come. He'd actually agreed to come before we knew the Pope was coming because he really believes in supporting these efforts. But it turned into a kind of magic moment when you have Arnold Schwarzenegger in the same room as the Pope, and that exchange between them was just fantastic. When Arnold turned to the Pope and said, "You're the real action hero," and then the Pope turned to all of us in the audience and said, "Well, these are the action heroes
Yeah,
here."
it's just such a beautiful moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
What about Jane? Because obviously a lot of your work is you're doing a lot of outreach, you're meeting people on the ground in Ireland. How do we, and this was one of the things that Pope Leo really talked about at this conference, was the spiritual kind of conversion of heart to wanting to care for our common home, to look after the earth that God has gifted us. How do we communicate that with people that not only is this really important in a practical sense, but it's also in a spiritual way?
hmm
How do we get it across? And did it come across at the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Pope Leo's words. He said there's no room for indifference or resignation when it comes to the ecological crisis. And then he said we need a freedom of the heart. And this he spoke about this ecological conversion, which is very much referenced to in Laudato Si. And over the last few years, we've been very heavily working at the grassroots for the last 10 years on Laudato Si initiatives across the country. Um, and I think one of the things that has really stood out to me in more recent years is the need for the spirituality piece, because as you say, there's a lot of climate anxiety out there. There's a lot of bad news. And for people already in the movement a very long time, there's fatigue. And when we start to kind of unpack all of that, Pope Francis said this. He said, at the heart of the ecological crisis is a deeply spiritual crisis. And if that's at the heart, then the response needs to be our interior life and contemplation and that reconnecting with nature. So we, in Drogheda and with the Laudato Si working group, we have found ourselves over the last few years creating resources and basically toolkits to help people in parishes explore this, to like, where are the spaces we can reconnect with nature? Where can we fall in love again with the earth? We've become so disconnected. And, how can we read the scriptures even in a more ecological lens? How do we pray, worship, our liturgies, our rituals? It all involves the elements of the earth. But as Pope Francis and Pope Leo said, we've forgotten this. We need to remember and to reconnect. And that came out really strongly in Pope Leo's words at the conference. And then we ritualized it throughout the conference in different ways, both with Pope Leo and the symbolic moment we had with him, but also in other ways with our interfaith community that was present, and at the different moments where we acknowledge this deep need to reconnect with God through creation and see that divine spark in nature again.
And is some of it as well about reminding people of one of the core elements of our faith is caring for the most vulnerable. And I mean, you had people visiting this conference from countries that are so directly impacted by climate change. I'm sure were sharing their own experiences with you firsthand. It feels like even since Laudato Si in those 10 years, there's even more consumerism, fast fashion. We're just bombarded with, these things that have such an impact on people and the planet. But is there a disconnect between the impact of our actions, how that's impacting vulnerable people and communities, and how our faith is at the center of trying to do something about that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's a risk that this issue of caring for the earth always slips down the agenda. It's very hard to keep it high on the agenda, like generally, like in the news. And we're at a point now where these disasters, we become almost
Apathetic in a way. Yeah.
apathetic, or like we don't even see the patterns. It's almost too hard for us to recognize that these weather freak events, emergencies, typhoons, ex-hurricanes, they're normalized. So I think there's a real role of the church to propose something different here. I mean, what really struck me at this conference is here we are. I've gone to, and I'm sure Jane has as well, countless climate conferences, environmental conferences. The one thing that is always missing is a sense of joy, a sense of hope, because there seems like nothing to be hopeful.
Because there's so much catastrophe.
It's so sad and it's so depressing. And yet the miracle of this event, in my mind, was the spirit of joy.
It started with the name, raising hope for climate justice. Yeah.
And I mean, I've been reflecting a lot on how is it, because that there was this spirit of joy. And I think there was that freedom that Jane spoke about. The Pope told us to return to the heart. And that obviously is a conversion that we all have to make every day. And recognise that returning to the heart of our faith, the heart of our spirituality, is quite simple. It's about caring for our brothers and sisters, about living simply, caring for the earth. And that's where the transformation really happens. Now, have things got better or worse since 2015? I think that there is still many, many challenges. The fact we're still talking about Laudato Si and that there is a huge movement now in existence is a sign of hope. And the fact that this conference brought many different people together from the secular world, from like the political world, to say in that spirit of hope is a real positive sign. But remember, Pope Francis also wrote Laudate Deum. almost as an appendix to Laudato Si um, 3 years ago. And that appendix, it's not even 3 years since he wrote it, basically said, we laid out in Laudato Si the change that needs to happen, but people haven't listened. So to me, there's a big communication issue around how do we communicate that message to the rest of the world, but also how do we embody that in our church. And I think all the process now around the synod, um, the next phase of the synod, is really important in saying it's not about the church becoming environmentalist. And I think people can misunderstand that.
Yeah,
It's
I think
not.
Pope Leo really made it so clear when, as part of his remarks, he said something along the lines of, God is going to ask us, how did you care for the planet?
Yeah.
Or even the piece of scripture where, Jesus tells us, however you care for the least of these. When we're asked the question, what did you do about this?
Yeah.
What will our answer be?
Exactly.
And maybe a lot of people haven't thought about it in that way.
Yeah.
And the question around the preferential option for the poor, and in the latest encyclical, it's mentioned so much, the preferential option for the poor. But you cannot attempt to answer that question or address that question without addressing the ecological crisis, because the ecological crisis is driving so much poverty in our world, and the most vulnerable people, who are on the front lines of the crisis, are really, really suffering. And like we highlighted that at Raising Hope through the symbolic action of the Bowl of Tears with Pope Leo, where people representing the most vulnerable groups in our world came forward and poured water from their homeland. So, for example, we'd Flossie Donnelly from Dublin, from Flossie and the Beach Cleaners, who represented the voice of youth, the voice of young people.
And is there a good contingent here in Ireland, Jane? I mean, you're meeting with people all the time. I know there was a good crew headed over to the conference from Ireland.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the takeaways from me was the presence of the Irish Laudato Si network at the conference. And someone jokingly said at the end there were more Irish here than Italians. But we had Bishop Martin Hayes representing the Irish Episcopal Conference, and he spoke on a very high level panel about what's happened in Ireland over the last 10 years, and spoke about projects that the bishops have led on, like Return to Nature, the divestment movement, all of those things. But there was the grassroots presence of the Laudato Si animators, who are working away in parishes across the country on the Eco Parish Award or the Season of Creation, or they're joining the climate strikes, or whatever it might be. I think people are finding their niche in the movement. And it was one of the first times I think we really brought that global grassroots movement together in person. And there was just huge energy from that, and joy. And I've been to climate conferences, I've been to COPs. They're not easy places to be. This was totally different.
Is that then a sign of what the church has to offer?
Absolutely.
About what's different about it?
Yeah, and that's
How would you sum it up for someone who has that maybe misinformed skepticism? Oh no, that's kind of the eco warriors. That's nothing to suit me and my faith and all that sort of that attitude. Whether it's them themselves or if they're trying to push something in their local parish or community, how do we kind of get that across? No, we actually have a really important role to play, and we have something different and hopeful that we can give in contrast to other elements of the movement.
Yeah, and Fridays for Future, for example, I'd hang out there from time to time at the Dáil on a Friday, and the very mixed group of people joined the climate strikes. But I remember one of them saying to me some years back, the faith-based people in this movement are going to have the longest staying power because it's so dark. And I was like, what do you mean by that? I was like, what's driving us? What's this about? And it's back to the piece around the heart and the conversion, that this is part of our Christian calling, and Laudato Si says that this is you feel like you're in the Good Friday of the crisis, but our faith tells us that's not the end of the story. Like we need to bring about that hope, and that's through the action piece.
And I think for people of faith, like, we act not because we're sure of the result. Faith isn't dependent on whether we have a good result at the end. Whether, people say to me, why do you keep going? Because it's all bleak and it's never going to work. And you're like, well, I act because I feel a moral responsibility, and that's independent of whether we get the result or not. The important thing, and it's back to the question the Pope asked us at the end of his speech, is how will I answer, at the end of my life and say that I've done my part? And I think that that's really where faith actors are driving this across the world, because what Jane described in Ireland is happening right across the world.
There's lots of good things happening.
Yeah,
There's lots of causes for hope. Finally,
Yeah.
then, for someone watching now or listening who's saying, okay, give me something concrete. What should I do? Where should I go? What resources should I use? If there was one kind of practical thing someone could do today, what would you suggest?
So after the conference, you could go online and look at raisinghope.earth conference, and you can sign up there to make your pledge. How are you going to take action? So we've launched a campaign that's called the People's Determined Contributions, the PDCs. And this is to send a message to COP30 about what people are doing, because we know that our governments right across the world, including here in Ireland, are not doing enough, because the crisis is really urgent, and they're not doing enough, and they're not making their national contributions ambitious enough. So we at the conference came up with this idea that why don't we match the national contributions of governments with the contributions of people of faith. This isn't just about going on a bicycle or using a paper straw. We're way beyond all of that. Yes, we need to do those things, and Pope Francis called them noble acts. But it's about thinking what one thing you could do in your community or with your family, or to raise climate action, to do something. It might be signing up to a newsletter of Laudato Si, joining a Chokra campaign. So go on to raisinghope.earth/action and you'll see what you can do.
Great stuff. And Jane, for people obviously who are involved in their local churches, Troker has lots of resources as well. I've seen them in my own local parish, which is great. Is that what you'd encourage?
Yeah, to get in touch with this, like the grassroots movement is alive, and we meet monthly online, and we try and support people who need support in whatever endeavor they'd like to get going in their parish. And there's something for everyone, whether it's liturgy or more advocacy campaigns or whatever it might be. But particularly, I think one of the things that is bringing a lot of active hope at the moment is return to nature, where parishes have been asked by the bishops to return 30% of church grounds to nature. And I think that's a great place to start, because there's so much expertise locally, and it's really bringing people together, and it's a tangible action that can lead
You can see
further.
it, yeah.
Exactly. So, but we're here to support. So please get in touch with us, and you'll be joining a vibrant, hope-filled movement.
Great stuff. Well, it's been lovely to have you both, and thank you for sharing, and great to have this conversation in the context of hope as well. Dr. Lorna Gold and Jane Mellet, thank you so much for being with us on The Way today. And thank you for joining us.